When you think of Billy the Kid, you probably picture shootouts, jailbreaks, and daring escapes. But what about the men who rode by his side? Among them was Charlie Bowdre, a cowboy turned outlaw whose life seemed cursed by bad luck from the start. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West, nor the most feared, yet his loyalty to Billy the Kid would seal his fate in a way that still echoes through Old West history. If you're fascinated by stories of forgotten gunfighters, legendary friendships, and the harsh realities of frontier justice,
Charles Bowdre was a cowboy of the American frontier who eventually became associated with Billy the Kid. As a member of the Kid Circle, he is remembered as one of the lesser-known figures of that turbulent era. Born in 1848 in Wilkes County, Georgia, Charlie was the first child of Albert and Lucy Bowdre. When he was about 3 years old, the family relocated to DeSoto County, Mississippi. It was there that Charlie grew up alongside his 6 younger siblings: Eppie, Sally, Volney, Benjamin William, and Lucy Lee, born between 1854 and 1863. By the mid-1850s, young Charlie was already helping with chores on his father's farm. Over time, he developed into a skilled and dependable farmer, a role that shaped much of his early life. What happened to Bowdre during the years following the birth of his youngest sister in 1863 up until around 1874 is largely unknown. Historical records from that period are scarce, leaving a gap in our understanding of his activities before he emerged on the western frontier. Historians believe that at some point, Charlie left the family farm and chose a more adventurous life. He likely departed around 1870, and by 1874, records place him in Lincoln County, New Mexico. During this period, Bowdre formed a close friendship with Doc Scurlock, another notable figure of the time. The two even partnered in an unusual business for the frontier, a small cheese-making operation along the Gila River. While building this enterprise, Bowdre also became involved in local law enforcement efforts. He occasionally joined posses organized to recover stolen livestock, a common problem in the region. These pursuits sometimes ended without legal proceedings, which reflected the informal and often chaotic nature of justice on the frontier. One of the most documented episodes occurred on July 18, 1876. Bowdre, alongside Scurlock, Frank Coe, George Coe, and Ab Saunders, intervened at the Lincoln jail to remove a captured cattle thief, Jesus Largo, from custody. The group took matters into their own hands outside the town, a decision that went unpunished by formal authorities. Later, on August 5, 1877, Bowdre and an associate faced arrest after an incident in Lincoln, where both men, reportedly under the influence of alcohol, discharged their firearms recklessly. Lincoln County War. The conflict that sparked the Lincoln County War can be traced back to a financial dispute over an insurance policy belonging to Emil Fritz, a business partner of L.G. Murphy. When Fritz passed away in 1874, the executors of his estate hired attorney Alexander McSween to collect the policy payout. After successfully securing the funds, McSween refused to release the money to the executor. His reasoning was tied to suspicions about the house, the powerful mercantile firm led by Murphy and James Dolan. The house insisted the money should go to them to cover an outstanding debt, but McSween believed the executor intended to hand over the funds to that faction. McSween was also well aware of the house's dire financial situation and likely wanted to prevent them from gaining any advantage, especially since they were his business rivals. Whether their claim had merit or not, McSween seemed determined to keep the funds out of their hands. In February 1878, legal proceedings were initiated, but the case was ultimately dismissed. Before that, however, the House managed to secure a court order to seize McSween's assets. In the process, they mistakenly included property belonging to John Tunstall, McSween's ally and business partner. Following this, Sheriff William Brady assembled a posse to confiscate Tunstall's remaining goods at his ranch, about 70 miles from Lincoln. Meanwhile, Dolan brought in reinforcements by aligning with the John Kinney gang, the Seven Rivers Warriors, and the Jesse Evans Gang. Their role was primarily to intimidate opponents and disrupt operations by taking livestock from ranches belonging to Tunstall and John Chisholm. These groups essentially acted as hired muscle for the house, escalating tensions that would soon erupt into open conflict. Killing of John Tunstall. On February 18, 1878, a posse under the authority of Sheriff Brady encountered John Tunstall and several of his ranch hands as they were moving his remaining 9 horses toward Lincoln. Among the men riding with Tunstall were Richard Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, John Middleton, Henry Newton Brown, Robert A. Weidman, and Fred Waite. Later investigations, including findings by Frank Warner Angel, a special agent for the U.S. Department of the Interior, concluded that Tunstall was deliberately killed by Jesse Evans, William Morton, and Tom Hill. Several of Tunstall's cowhands, including Brewer and Billy the Kid, saw the event from a distance, but could do little to intervene. Tunstall's death marked the beginning of what became known as the Lincoln County War. Outraged by the killing and the lack of faith in the territorial justice system, largely influenced by Murphy and Dolan, Tunstall's men and other supporters organized a group that came to be called the Regulators. While the Regulators' size fluctuated, the core members, often referred to as the Ironclad, included Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, Dick Brewer, Frank McNabb, Doc Scurlock, Jim French, John Middleton, George and Frank Coe, Jose Chavez y Chavez, Charlie Bowdre, Tom O'Folliard, Fred Waite, and Henry Newton Brown. Initially, the Regulators sought to bring those responsible for Tunstall's death to justice through legal means. They obtained warrants from the Lincoln County Justice of the Peace and acted under the authority of Constable Saturnino Martinez. However, Sheriff Brady defied this effort by arresting Martinez and several Regulators, jailing them despite their legal authority. Eventually released, the Regulators resumed their search for the men implicated in Tunstall's killing. They soon located Buck Morton, Frank Baker, and Dick Lloyd near the Rio Penasco. After a prolonged chase spanning several miles, Morton agreed to surrender on the condition that both he and Baker, who had not participated in Tunstall's death but was riding with the group, would be escorted safely back to Lincoln. Dick Brewer, then serving as the Regulators' leader, promised they would be returned alive. However, growing tensions within the group led to disagreement over the prisoners' fate. William McCloskey, a Regulator and friend of Morton, strongly opposed any harm coming to them, insisting they honor their commitment. Blackwater Massacre. On March 9, 1878, during the 3rd day of the Regulators' journey back toward Lincoln with the captured men, a tragic incident occurred in the Captain Foothills near Blackwater Creek. Morton, Baker, and McCloskey all lost their lives under circumstances that remain controversial to this day. The official claim by the Regulators was that Morton shot McCloskey and then attempted to flee with Baker, forcing the group to act in self-defense. However, this explanation raised doubts almost immediately. Many found it difficult to believe Morton would have harmed McCloskey, who was known to be his only ally among the Regulators. Physical evidence further fueled suspicion. Both Morton and Baker were found with multiple gunshot wounds. Reports suggest Morton was struck as many as 10 times and Baker 5 times. Historian Robert Utley notes that early accounts implied each Regulator may have fired at least once, casting serious doubt on the story of an attempted escape. McCloskey's death was also widely believed to have resulted from his objections to harming the prisoners. Coincidentally, that same day, 2 of the men involved in Tunstall's killing, Tom Hill and Jesse Evans, were confronted near Tularosa during an attempted theft from a sheep herder. Hill did not survive the encounter, and Evans sustained serious injuries. Evans was later taken to Fort Stanton for medical treatment, where he was arrested on an outstanding federal warrant for livestock theft from an Indian reservation. Killing of William Brady. Sheriff William Brady, increasingly concerned about the lawlessness in Lincoln County, sought help from the Territorial Attorney General, Thomas Benton Catron. Catron referred the matter to Governor Samuel B. Axtell, who soon issued rulings that dramatically altered the situation. Governor Axtell declared that John Wilson, the local justice of the peace, who had deputized the regulators and issued warrants for Tunstall's killers, had been appointed illegally by the county commissioners. This ruling effectively invalidated the regulators' earlier authority, making their actions, once recognized as legal, now considered unlawful. In addition, Axtell revoked Robert A. Widman's commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal. With this change, Sheriff Brady and his deputies were left as the sole recognized law officers in Lincoln County. Tensions reached a breaking point on April 1st, 1878. That morning, several regulators, including Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, Jim French, Frank McNabb, John Middleton, Fred Waite, and Henry Brown, waited in the corral behind Tunstall's store. Their target was Sheriff Brady and his deputies as they moved along Lincoln's main street. When the shooting erupted, Brady was struck multiple times and died at the scene. Deputy George W. Heineman was also mortally wounded. After the initial gunfire, Billy the Kid and Jim French rushed from cover toward Brady's body. Historians debate their intent. Some believe they hoped to retrieve an arrest warrant for Alexander McSween, while others suggest they aimed to recover Billy's rifle, which Brady had confiscated during an earlier arrest. During this attempt, both men were hit by the same bullet fired by Deputy Billy Matthews, who managed to return fire despite the chaos. French's injury was severe, forcing him to hide temporarily in a small crawl space at the home of Sam Corbett for recovery. Weidman was present at the corral during the incident, but whether he actively participated remains unclear. He later claimed he was there only to feed Tunstall's dog at the time of the attack. Battle of Blazers Mill. 3 days after the deaths of Sheriff Brady and Deputy Heineman, the regulators left the vicinity of Lincoln and traveled southwest. Their route took them to Blazers Mill, a sawmill and trading post that also provided beef to the nearby Mescalero Apache community. At Blazers Mill, the regulators unexpectedly encountered Buckshot Roberts, a rancher whose name appeared on their list of men wanted in connection with the Tunstall case. What followed was a violent confrontation that became one of the most memorable episodes of the Lincoln County War. During the exchange of gunfire, Roberts sustained fatal injuries, but not before he inflicted serious losses on the regulators. Richard "Dick" Brewer, their leader at the time, was killed in the fight. Several others, John Middleton, Doc Scurlock, George Coe, and Billy the Kid, were also wounded to varying degrees. This incident further deepened the conflict and demonstrated the unpredictable and deadly nature of the war, where even a single determined opponent could dramatically alter the course of events. Gunfight at Fritz Ranch. Following the loss of Dick Brewer at Blazers Mill, the regulators chose Frank McNabb as their new captain. By late April, tensions in Lincoln County continued to rise. On April 29, 1878, Sheriff George Pepin led a posse that included members of the Jesse Evans Gang and the Seven Rivers Warriors. This group confronted a small band of regulators, McNabb, Ab Saunders, and Frank Coe, at Fritz Ranch. In the exchange that followed, McNabb was killed, Saunders sustained severe injuries, and Frank Coe was taken prisoner. The following day, 4 men from the Seven Rivers faction, Tom Green, Charles Marshall, Jim Patterson, and John Galvin, were killed in Lincoln. Although the regulators were widely suspected of the attack, concrete evidence was never produced. Frank Coe eventually escaped custody under mysterious circumstances. According to some reports, Deputy Sheriff Wallace Ollinger may have assisted him, even providing a pistol to aid in his flight. The day after McNabb's death, the Corps regulators, often referred to as the Ironclad, moved into Lincoln and fortified defensive positions. They exchanged gunfire with Dolan's men and, according to some accounts, even members of the U.S. Army Cavalry. During this standoff, George Coe seriously wounded Dolan's supporter, Dutch Charlie Crueling. By allegedly engaging federal troops, the regulators inadvertently added another powerful adversary to their growing list of enemies. On May 15th, The regulators captured Manuel Segovia, a member of the Jesse Evans gang suspected of killing McNabb. Segovia was fatally shot during what was reported as an escape attempt. Around this time, the regulators welcomed a new member, a young Texas cowboy named Tom O'Folliard, who quickly became one of Billy the Kid's closest companions. Battle of Lincoln, 1878. The largest and most decisive clash of the Lincoln County War began on July 15, 1878, in the town of Lincoln. The regulators were divided into two main positions. Some took refuge in the McSween home, while others occupied the Ellis store. Surrounding them were forces loyal to the Murphy-Dolan faction, including members of the Seven Rivers Group. Inside the Ellis store were Doc Scurlock, Charlie Bowdre, John Middleton, Frank Coe, and several others. Additionally, about 20 Mexican regulators, under the command of Josefita Chavez, were strategically positioned at various points around town. Meanwhile, the McSween home housed Alexander McSween, his wife Susan, Billy the Kid, Henry Brown, Jim French, Tom O'Folliard, Jose Chavez y Chavez, George Coe, and a number of Mexican vaqueros. For 3 days, both sides exchanged gunfire and tense verbal challenges. During this standoff, Tom Cullens, a supporter inside the McSween house, was killed by a stray bullet. Around the same time, Henry Brown, George Coe, and Joe Smith left the McSween home for the Tunstall store, where they cornered 2 Dolan men in an outhouse with rifle fire, forcing them to hide in desperation. The deadlock continued until U.S. Army troops under Colonel Nathan Dudley arrived. The soldiers brought heavy firepower, including cannons, which they aimed at the Ellis store and other strongholds. Faced with overwhelming force, Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, and their men abandoned their positions, as did Josefita Chavez and his fighters, leaving those inside the McSween home increasingly isolated. On the afternoon of July 19th, the Murphy-Dolan faction set the McSween house ablaze. As the fire spread and dusk approached, Susan McSween, another woman, and 5 children were allowed to leave safely. The remaining men stayed behind, attempting to fight the flames and prepare for a possible escape. By 9 p.m., the situation became desperate. Billy the Kid and Jim French devised a plan to break out using covering fire. French went first, followed by Billy, Tom O'Folliard, and Jose Chavez y Chavez. As they ran, Dolan's men opened fire, killing Harvey Morris, McSween's legal associate. In the backyard, chaos erupted when soldiers moved in to capture those still inside. In the confusion, Alexander McSween and Bob Beckwith of the Seven Rivers faction were both killed. Amid the turmoil, 3 Mexican regulators managed to slip away and regroup with the remaining members of the ironclad nearby. Aftermath. The Lincoln County War ultimately resolved little. Instead of restoring order, it left behind deep mistrust and lingering hostility throughout the region. The surviving regulators, most famously Billy the Kid, remained fugitives, continuing to live outside the law. Over time, the group began to fragment. Billy stayed active with a small circle that included Charlie Bowdre, Tom O'Folliard, Dave Rudabaugh, and a few others. Together, they engaged in cattle rustling and other outlaw activities across New Mexico. Their run eventually came to an end when Sheriff Pat Garrett took on the task of bringing them to justice. Garrett's posse tracked down and killed O'Folliard, then Bowdre, and finally in July 1881, Billy the Kid himself. All 3 men were laid to rest at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, a burial site that remains a point of fascination to this day. On the legal side, changes in federal law had an impact on how the war played out. The Posse Comitatus Act, signed on June 18, 1878, restricted the use of federal troops in the civilian law enforcement. However, President Rutherford B. Hayes invoked the Insurrection Act of 1807 later that year, on October 7th, allowing soldiers to intervene in Lincoln County. Several key figures also met very different fates. L.G. Murphy, whose influence had loomed large during the war, died of cancer on October 20th, 1878, at about age 47. Susan McSween, widowed after her husband's death, hired attorney Houston Chapman to press charges against James Dolan and others, while also seeking amnesty for the remaining regulators. Tragically, Chapman was killed on February the 18th, 1879, exactly 1 year after John Tunstall's death, by Jesse Evans and Billy Campbell, both of whom fled the territory. The crime was widely attributed to Dolan's faction, though no definitive proof emerged. Dolan himself was indicted for Tunstall's murder, but later acquitted. He managed to acquire all of Tunstall's former holdings before passing away on his ranch in 1898 at age 49. Susan McSween, by contrast, built a new life. She established a large cattle ranch at Three Rivers, New Mexico, which became one of the most successful in the region during the 1890s. At its peak, her ranch supported between 3,000 and 5,000 head of cattle. When she died on January 3, 1931, at age 85, she was regarded as one of the wealthiest and most influential women in New Mexico. After the Lincoln County War. As the Lincoln County War continued, Charlie Bowdre divided his time between working as a cowboy on the ranches of Thomas Yerby and Pete Maxwell, and remaining loosely connected to the conflict. Sometime before his death, Bowdre married a young Mexican woman named Manuela Herrera, born Maria Manuela Herrera, on April 20th, 1866. She was the daughter of Jose Fernando Herrera, a friend and associate of Bowdre, and Maria Juliana Martin. Interestingly, Manuela was also the sister of Maria Antonia Miguela Herrera, known as Antonia, who was married to Doc Scurlock, one of Bowdre's closest companions. The timing of this marriage, occurring only months before his death, has led some historians to suggest that Bowdre may have been preparing to settle down and distance himself from Billy the Kid's activities. However, circumstances pulled him back into the outlaw life. By December 1880, Bowdre was reportedly ready to surrender and leave the gang, even considering turning himself in for his role in the killing of Buckshot Roberts. Despite these intentions, he agreed to ride with Billy the Kid on what would become one of their final missions, an attempt to ambush Sheriff Pat Garrett near Fort Sumner. The plan failed, resulting in a skirmish, but Bowdre and most of the group managed to escape unharmed. Their reprieve was short-lived. On December 23, 1880, Garrett's posse tracked the gang to an isolated stone building at Stinking Springs, New Mexico. During the night, the lawmen surrounded the hideout. At dawn, Bowdre stepped outside to tend to the horses, unaware of the danger. Shots rang out, and he was struck multiple times before collapsing back toward the doorway. Accounts suggest that Billy the Kid urged him to make one last effort, but Bowdre, gravely wounded, could barely stand. He stumbled forward, unable to draw his revolver, and reportedly muttered his final words, I wish, before falling. His body was later returned to Manuela, and he was buried in the cemetery at Fort Sumner, alongside his friend Tom O'Folliard. Less than a year later, Billy the Kid himself would join them, after his death in July 1881. Charlie Bowdre's life was a whirlwind of loyalty, bad luck, and tragic timing. From riding with Billy the Kid to becoming entangled in the bloody Lincoln County War, Bowdre was never the fastest gun or the most notorious outlaw, but fate ensured his name would forever be tied to the legends of the Old West. In the end, his unwavering friendship and courage made him unforgettable, even if his luck ran out on that fateful day at Stinking Springs.
Please like and share if you find the video content interesting and useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below so as not to miss the upcoming interesting videos. Thanks for watching.